Hi, and thanks for joining this session on bioenergy and energy demand. I'm Helene Bartelings. I'm a researcher at Wageningen Economic Research, and I will be chairing this session. And Macroeconomic Chapter from the Center of Global Trade Analysis is hosting and recording today's session. And he will hopefully make sure that we keep to our allotted time. We will have 4 papers in the session. And I guess you already know from all the other sessions that you followed that the presentations will be 20 minutes. And Maxime will give a warning 2 minutes before time. And after 20 minutes, we have time for questions. And you can either put your questions in the chat or just raise your hand. And then, well, with further ado, let's get to our first paper. We have a change in presenters. Jingwen Li will present this paper about using CGE results together with machine learning. So, Lingwin, the floor is yours.
Everybody can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jingwen Li, and I'm a postdoc in Institute for Food and Resource Economics in the University of Bonn. And here today, I'm very glad to present on behalf of my colleagues, Lin Mei Sheng, who's sitting here, and Wolfgang Gries, Professor Wolfgang Gries, who's also here today, and Professor Jan Bonner. And the title of our paper is Combining Large-Scale Sensitivity Analysis in CGE Models with Machine Learning. And this is an example application on bioeconomy promotions policies. So let's get started. First, a little bit background and motivation about our project. And as you may all know, today, policy design is facing a lot of challenges. First, we're facing so many different goals. Some covering economic aspects, some covering social aspects, some are environmental goals, and most of them are overlapping and some are conflicting. And of course, we have very large set of policy measures for bioeconomy policy initiatives, like how it can perform, and which just brings out a lot of complexity when talking about policy designs. And second, it is very important for potential international collaboration for us to talk about the trade-offs or the co-benefits for individual national policies. Because there's just so many countries in this world, and if we want to get some international collaboration, the complexity bring up by different individual national policies just bring up a lot more complexity again. So this altogether just give us this so-called curse of dimensionality with so many different goals, so many different potential outcome measures, and so many different countries in the world. And also, methodologically, we also face the challenges when we talk about CG models. Usually we use CG models when we do policy analysis. Actually, what we do is to do impact assessment instead of policy design, because each counterfactual experiment for a CG model can do is just very limited scenarios. But the detailed policy options are unknown, but to be found based on the experiments, the limited experiments that we can do. And also, when we talking about CG models, the parameter uncertainties have always been the problem before. That how we choose the key parameters like the parameters of elasticity of substitution between different key sectors, or for trade, like the Armington elasticities that CG models can always be sensitive to. So this is the motivation of our project. And it comes to the research design. We combine a large-scale sensitivity analysis with machine learning techniques, which is actually a neural networks model, to assess a bunch of indicator outcomes we choose from a large set of model runs. And at the same time, we consider alternative policy mixes and model parameterizations. So the ultimate goal in the end is to later identify a quasi-optimal policy choices while we consider all the model uncertainties altogether. And this is our research steps, and I'm gonna organize the following presentation like that. The first step is to integrate bioeconomy sectors into CG models. For example, bioplastics or biofuels. And second, we're gonna choose a set of indicator variables, later we call it outcomes, from CG models, which can use as a measurement for bioeconomy policies. And third, we do a Monte Carlo sensitivity analysis, which is actually Monte Carlo sampling process based on policy mixes and the parameters. And we, after a large amount of draw, a random draw, we can get a large data set, which later will be used for the machine learning or the neural networks model. And we also use some different indicators to interpret the prediction results. So first, this is how we integrate bioeconomy sectors into CG models. As you can see, this is actually a pretty standard GTAP model. Like we have the all the sectors using the Liang-T production function to form the total intermediate input. But what we did was we actually disaggregate the plastics or the chemical sector into bioplastics and fossil-based plastics based on some former works. And we also disaggregate fuels, which was originally the petroleum and coke sectors, into biofuels, which are actually ethanol and biodiesel, with and all the others. We also allow the substitution between bioplastic and fossil-based plastics equals to 10 at the beginning, and the substitution between biofuels and other fuels equals to 0.5, which is actually pretty small, that we assume there are more complements instead of substitutes. And we implement this model in CGBox, which is actually a platform that extends the standard GTAP model into more flexible modules, like for land use, for emissions, for trade, value chain, for energy sectors, and we also and the whole data is based on the GTAP term database. We aggregate all the countries into 31 regions. Some are individual countries, and the others are aggregated as regions. And also we have 68 sectors in total. And this is the indicators we chose from CGBox or CG model. And we choose from different aspects. For example, economic growth, we have real GDP per capita to measure regional income. We also have specific indicators for bioeconomy, like the total output or value added. We also have indicators to measure inequality. For example, we use a wage gap between skilled labor and unskilled labor to measure the inequality between different labors. We also have real GDP standard deviation of all countries to measure the international inequality. And we also have calories intake per capita and food price, which is the weighted average supply price for all the food sectors. And also have land cover change for different categories, for forest, for grazing, for agriculture, and green gas emissions, for example, which include both CO2 and non-CO2. And this, what we call outcome indicators, these are just served as outputs or dependent variable, if that's easier to understand. And we also have drivers or inputs, which are actually exogenous variables in CGE model. And we just pick 4. The first 2 are actually factor productivity increase for different factors. The first is for labor, just for bioeconomy sectors. And the second is for land in all the agriculture sectors, which represent the raw material productivity. And we also have tax incentive, which is actually subsidies on bioeconomy sectors. For example, indirect subsidies on domestic consumption and indirect subsidies on imported consumption. And they will be in negative numbers because, you know, subsidies and the tax are kind of opposite in the sign. And this is our workflow. And first, how we did is we draw all those inputs or the drivers randomly from a uniform distribution. For example, for the first 2 factor productivity input, we allow them to change from a uniform distribution with lower bound of 0.5 to as high as 0.2. And for the subsidies drivers, we allow them to change from 0.5 to 0.1. And we draw for 20,000 times. And each time we consider it as a single shock. So we just gather all the selected outcome variables or the outputs together, store them in single GTX files, and then we collect them together, merge them into one big data set. And until now, everything is implemented in CGBox. And then with all gathered the summary GTX data set, we can do our deep neural network training based on this data set. And what we did is we actually split the whole 20,000 samples into training set and the test set, of which 90% of the samples are training set and 10% are test set. This is a brief introduction for neural networks. Neural networks at the first time actually inspired by a real biological neural or nervous system. And this is a single graph for a single artificial neural. And what we have a layer of all the inputs and a single neural. And what happens in it is it's a composite function with inner part as a linear regression with all the weights W for each X. And the outer part is a activation function. And there's all different kinds of activation function you can choose from, but what we use is ReLU, which is actually taking maximum between 0 and X. And then it delivers all the information to Y. And this is the graph for a deep neural network. Deep means really it has 2 hidden layers, because we have input layers and then hidden layers, which consists of different amounts of neurons. And the last layer will be the output layer, and of course we could have multiple outputs. As in our case, we have all the outcome indicators, not just one output. And this is our structure, the design of our deep neural networks. And as we said before, we picked 4 drivers input, but the curves of dimensionality means if we change those 4 drivers differently for different countries, we have to multiply the dimension of countries. So in the end, we will have 124 inputs together. And the same thing happens for the outputs. Here is just we just showcase our a simplified version of the model, which we just pick 3 output to just make the example more simpler. For example, we just pick calories intake per capita and the world GDP per capita and emissions. And just with this 3 single variable, we also have to multiply by the countries. So in the end, we have 93 outputs together. And we just input all the drivers in it, and we have 2 hidden layers. The first layer we have 700 nodes, and the second layer we have 512 nodes altogether. And with this kind of model structure, what we get is a pretty good R-square as the fitness of the model, all over 99.99%, very good. But it's also very important to interpret the prediction, right? So what we did is we use a indicator called shock value, which is Shockley additive explanations, which actually compute an indicator of the importance of the contribution of each input on all the outputs. And on the left-hand side, you could look at this, like they look complicated, but they are actually just tagland, which is the the driver multiplies different countries. That's how we just increase the dimension. And on all the colors on the right-hand side are different outputs. So if we just add them on together, and we could get which is the most important for the prediction power of all the outputs, which turns out tech land in general, which is the factor productivity of land for all the agriculture sectors, and followed by subsidies, and followed by factor productivity for laborers. And this kind of makes sense because if we think about the shock that we're giving to the model, actually the agriculture sectors are just a large portion of the economy, and the land is as the most important factor for all the agriculture sectors. It just makes sense that this productivity will play the most important role. And if we consider the factor labor, we only shock for bioeconomy sectors, which means we only have 3 bioeconomy sectors, and they are still considered pretty small compared with agriculture sectors. And here, if we zoom in, for example, we just pick 1 output, here the GDP per capita for EU28, and we could look at which is the most important at giving the biggest shock value, and turns out to be the tag land of EU28, which is the factor productive of land for EU countries, followed by the tag land of, this is actually the rest of Latin America, and followed by tag land of USA, and Brazil and China and India. And this kind of makes sense when we think about how large volume of the agriculture trade happening between all the countries. And yeah, almost all are tag land, not many subsidies at all at this level. So
2 minutes.
okay, so the here comes our conclusion. The first is with this well-trained deep neural networks model, we can predict accurately and fast the response of CG models with different policy mixes, even without running our CG models. and it shows great potential to serve as a surrogate model for CG models and for policy design. But it becomes a little bit trickier when we add parameter uncertainties. Parameter, for example, which I mean, the substitution elasticities of these two. When we add parameters like that, the fitness just drop substantially. For example, in our case with 3 outcomes, it just dropped from 99% to 90%. So our further steps, the first is to fine-tune the neural network model to improve the fitness in the case of parameter uncertainty. And the second is to optimize over the neural network to find the optimal, quasi-optimal international bioeconomy policy mix. So that's pretty much all. Thank you. Should I stop sharing?
Then you are muted.
Thank you, Jingwen. It was a nice, interesting presentation. Are there any questions to Jingwen? Yes, I see that there's a question from David. Do you want to say it yourself or should I read it?
Yeah, I can. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. My question was just, are these machine learning models kind of emulator of your CGE model? Can we say it that way? And if so, how in general are such emulators being validated? And have you validated them?
And sorry, could you repeat the word again?
Validated. How are you validated? Yes.
Oh, okay. Validated. I mean, the neural networks have its own validation methods. We're not plugging back to CG models. Usually, what we do is after we getting all the results from CG models, and then we just plug in neural networks. And in theory, if we have a large enough sample size, neural networks can give really good predictions on those results. For example, 99.9%, which already means a very good prediction power. If that neural network itself passed the validation process.
If I may add here, I mean, we use 10% of the data as an out-of-sample set, and we had the same prediction quality in the out-of-sample than in the training set. So that is the typical validation you do for this machine learning procedures.
Thank you, Wolfgang.
Are there any more questions?
Ellen, perhaps I could ask one question. It's just,
yes.
It seems like a lot of calculation. So, I mean, how much kind of computer time are we talking about?
Jingwen, the draws, how long did it take?
Yeah, so for each run, as for example, let me show you the table. For a sample size like this, and what we do is we use a batch mode on CG box, and we parallel run this batch mode on different servers, and each run actually just take less than 1 minute, I would say. And we just let them run like in parallel. And for example, we loop for 20,000, and it would take less than 3 days, 2.5.
And Jingwen, how robust are your results now? So if you, so you say that you can use it for different policy questions. If you change something in your model, you have to do this whole 3 days again to get a new data set, or?
You mean change the structure in CG models?
Yes, or if you,
I think that depends. For example, what we're trying to do is we're trying to change the the shape of the production function a little bit. Like, for example, if we change the substitution elasticity here, like we basically change a little bit, you know, the shape of the production function. And then we're trying to change a lot by a large sample. So in the end, we could get if we could get an accurate prediction, then I would say, no, we don't have to run the CG models again and again.
I mean, the really interesting point comes if you optimize, right? So far, basically, we use this to basically predict on the same input set, but you can also optimize over the surrogate model, yeah? And so say, okay, I mean, I want to increase GDP in all the region by at least 0.5% and don't accept a change in emissions, which is greater S and so on, yeah? And you can run then basically a constraint optimization model having the surrogate model as the objective function. I don't think that is computational possible within CGE. Yeah, not with the kind of size we are dealing with here. I think then that's the final aim, basically. Yeah.
A quick one comment and one question, if I may. So, if I correctly understood, so these 3 days, for instance, of run is just for varying 2 parameters essentially. One is a policy variable, and another that is shown like a substitution elasticity. So if we want to look into, let's say, a different policy measure, we would need to again rerun everything. And while one run takes just 1 minute, I mean, it would take just 1 minute to run the CG model itself to get the answer. I mean, definitely getting back to Wolfgang's point in terms of optimization, this would bring a lot of benefit. But in terms of predicting results itself, if we would like to optimize over several layers of policy measures and parameters, it would be essentially kind of like a factorial. So it would just explode in the number of runs, if I understand correctly, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, if you just want to, say, predict a kind of smaller set of possible policies, then of course you could always run the CG models and just pick several variables, and probably each run takes a short time. But the difference is, if we want to know what is the optimal policy we can get, like it's kind of, we can do it vice versa. We can say, okay, this is the outcome of some policies, but we cannot see what is the best policies for what kind of outcome we want, right? This is our ultimate goal for this kind of model.
Okay, yeah, I was just having in mind, for instance, exploration of several policies that interact. So we can have a carbon price, we can have a renewable subsidy, and we can have a different transfer mechanism to households. So essentially, this would multiply.
Yep.
Yeah. So just for understanding. And then the second question is, so is there any kind of like a way or approach to reduce the number of runs instead of, I know something similar, for instance, there's a systematic sensitivity analysis in the GTAP framework. So kind of you get the distribution and which you would use to approximate your kind of the whole set of runs, which would significantly reduce their number of needed runs, but at the same time would keep their reliability of outcome relatively kind of high. It's maybe in terms of improving the possible computational time. Is it something that you consider?
Yeah, I mean, you could also use something like hypercube sampling, yeah. And I mean, the interesting point is here that we also want to learn basically what is the number of runs you need, so to say, for a certain model complexity from which you can train such a network. Yeah. So we keep on adding, so to say, runs on top, and see basically if the network still changes. Yeah. Exactly, to give perhaps later hints and say, okay, of a model of this complexity, you probably need 10,000 runs or 5,000 runs or perhaps only 1,000 runs. Yeah. So basically, how much you need depends on the nonlinearity of this response surface. Yeah? So the more regular, basically, that multidimensional response surface, the less points you need basically to train the network, and the less complexity you need in the network.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, but very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jingwen. I think we have to go on to the next presentation, which is the presentation of Susanna Kriskova. And she will present how to model green investments. Susanna, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Helena. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy that I can today present our joint work on assessing the impact of green investments using a magnet model. As you can see, it is a teamwork of myself and my other colleagues at Wageningen Economic Research, namely David, Kui, and Andre, Hans, and Helena, the chair of this session, and also our colleagues at the JRC. My presentation will be devoted on looking at how we can analyze the impact of green investments. Well, during various sessions in this conference, we already talked about climate change mitigation and the importance of the Paris Agreement in limiting global warming. As in the context of this, the European Union has responded with a new growth strategy, which aims to, it's quite ambitious, which aims to transform the EU into a resource-efficient and competitive economy with no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050. So the Europe's man on the moon moment. And so this obviously is an important also trigger for triggers a lot of economic questions and a whole new concept of green investment. So green investment is defined as public investment with a greening character. So it can be investment in green infrastructure and non-infrastructure, R&D, but also importantly, bioenergy, bioeconomy. So with this all, there comes a need to evaluate the potential impacts of this investment boost, and the European Commission is even asking explicitly for CGE-based analysis in this area. So this is the context of our research, and therefore the objectives, not surprisingly, are to evaluate the economic and environmental and possibly also social impacts of such a boost in green investments. Well, in order to achieve this, we have done some enhancement in our magnet modeling framework that I will explain now. And then we used the new features in a set of illustrative scenarios that look at the impact of green investments. And we focused on bioenergy sectors, and we look basically on two perspectives, on the perspective of financing of these investments and the impact of technology learning. So that's to introduce the objectives of this study. Let me move to the methodological approach. So we are using a magnet CGE model, which is a model that is based on GTAP model and associated database. And Magnet is well equipped to analyze the so-called food, land, energy, water, climate nexus because it has various interesting features. For example, very detailed structure of bioeconomy sectors and also food and nutrition sectors. It has a flexible production function or production tree, which allows that for a different product type of technology, we use different nests and different type of inputs. It also has dedicated modules for greenhouse gas emissions, which is of course very relevant in this case, but as well as waste and circular economy, natural resource extraction, etc. And also, last but not least, there is a SDG module, so dedicated module to provide, for example, Sustainable Development Goals perspective. So not to only focus on GDP, but other indicators. There are more information if somebody is interested on the website. Now, having said all this, if we want to analyze the impact of green investments, Magnet still needs to have some additional features, some enhancements. So we have implemented, we work in a sort of step-by-step approach. We introduce step-by-step new features first in a smaller version, toy version, a couple of sectors, couple of regions, and then we implemented it in our full version. So the first important step is if we want to model, let's say, a change of investment mix, we want to inject money into certain sectors, so we need to capture very well the linkage between investments and capital stock. So first thing first, starting with converting Magnet to a recursively dynamic model. And from that, going the next step is to make sure that the capital markets are sector specific, so that we can distinguish between different investments to different sectors. So that was the first thing we did. So we assessed various options, and we implemented a Tobin Q investment function, which is basically a function that enables to distribute regional investments into various sectors based on their rates of return. So sectors with higher rates of return attract more investments. So that was the first thing. The second step was to introduce exogenous sector-specific investments. So we have our Magnet model follows the GTAP behavior investment allocation. So there is a global bank that distributes regional investments. So there are some choices that are based on rates of return, profitability, but we want in our exercise also to be able to inject or to support some sectors from public money, so not based on private return. So to basically to steer investment mix to green sector. So that was the second step we introduced. That already enables, if we change the investment mix to more green sectors, that will already contribute to, let's say, reduce emissions and more energy transition. But this is not enough, because we want that the green sectors over time become more competitive, and then they will take over more easily. So we want to speed up the energy transition, and therefore we implement the third step. That is the technology learning effects in the green sector. So we want to stimulate the green transition. The following slide is a little bit more on the technology learning effects. We distinguish learning by doing and learning by research, which are the common technology learning effects, where the learning by doing basically means that with every doubled installation capacity, the costs are decreasing. And learning by research is a similar thing, but the productivity improvements come from R&D. So the mechanism that you see here is that from the investment boost in, let's say, green sectors and R&D sectors, we create more capital stock, and that both physical capital stock and knowledge stock is then translated via the learning rates into a higher productivity, so production cost decrease. And because of that important factor that we have the flexible production structure, and there is a possibility to substitute the fossil and green inputs in the production structure, that is then reflected in a finally decrease of total emissions. We focus in our study on the following green sectors. We have bioelectricity, biogas, biodiesel, second generation biofuels, also residues, pellets, wind, solar, and hydroelectricity. Now I will explain a bit about how we designed our green investment scenarios and the baseline. The baseline scenario we ran in 5-year periods until 2050 with very standard assumptions from the literature using the SSP tools on population and GDP growth, etc. We have the sector-specific investment allocation function, and we implemented the learning by doing and learning by research in, as I mentioned, the selected green sectors of the economy. As for the R&D, we have implemented R&D in energy technology, and in the baseline, we fix it on the 2020 level. So this is very shortly about baseline scenario. I will move to the policy scenarios. So we want to see how all these new features, to test them basically, how they behave. And for that, we took an inspiration from various materials. In our case, we looked at McKinsey Net Zero Europe that talks about potential ways to decarbonize the economy. And as a part of the document, there is an estimation that the investments, the green investment would take up to $700 billion cumulative. So we take over approximately this value and we apply it in our scenario. So it is 70 billion annually. And we distribute it over the EU countries that we have in our model and the green sectors proportionally to the baseline investments. Well, the table what you see here is that if we look at the green sectors themselves, the shock is quite substantial. So we are increasing investments by 200% or 800%. But because these sectors are still quite small, the share of green investment in the economy is around 1%. So that does not represent a very huge intervention in the model. Well, but after the simulation, we bring the share of this green economy to 2%. So that's about the size of the shocks we are implementing. As for the R&D shocks, there we assume we take an assumption basically that the R&D investments in energy technology would increase by 25%. And that we implement in the period 2020 to 2030. So that's how we came up with the values. But another important aspect to consider here, if we talk about modeling the impact of investment, is to look at how are these investments actually going to be financed. So there are various, let's say, crowd out effects that can happen. For example, we can say we boost green economy by 70 billion. But the private investments that would normally happen would decline and there would be a total squeeze out. We don't want that. So we want to make sure that green sectors will receive the 70 or in total $700 billion. But the first option is if there is no additional financing, then inevitably investments in the other sectors must decline because there is a certain crowd out effect. So that the first option, we call it EU crowd out. So the green investments green sectors are supported, but on account of the others. So we use a risk premium variable that we have in order to achieve this. Another option is that, well, we are still constrained with the fact that Magnet is not a financial model. So there are not so many instruments we can use, but still we can, for example, imagine that the increased green investments would come on account of consumption. So we can force to increase temporarily savings rate. So that we can, that is a scenario that is called EU savings rate. So that does not create a crowd out effect. So we can have a parallel coexistence of increased green investments, but also the other investments will still be there. And then yet the other option that is possible to consider is that the EU will somehow borrow for that green boost from the rest of the world, because there is the global bank that redistributes investments based on rates of return. Well, and if we use the variable CGD slack in magnet model, then we can adjust the expected rates of return such that EU attracts more money to be able to achieve this investment increase. So if we think about this, we have in fact a multi-dimensional setup of scenarios. So we have 3 different crowd out financing options, and we run this apart for a case without technology learning and with technology learning. So that's to introduce the scenario setups, and now let me go to the results. So we have selected only the most important results. First of all, let me explain a bit how to read this figure, because there's a lot of information here. So we use colors to distinguish scenarios that have technology learning. These are the green colors, and without technology learning. And then we use also the dashes to distinguish the financing. Let me first talk about the, let's say, the most moderate, simple scenario where we increase we increase green investments, but there is a crowd out effect, so the investments in other sectors must decline because there is no extra financing. So we see that this option is actually leads to a decrease of GDP. This is because there is a suboptimal allocation of investment. So we force the investment structure to be different, that it would be in optimum, and that green sectors increase, but some other sectors like industry and services, their investments must decline, and that produces a negative impact on GDP. For example, exports are temporarily also decline, etc. Then we have another result. These are for the increased savings rate. So clearly, this is not a very good option. If we force the EU countries to increase their savings to finance for this green effect, probably over the time the effect would return back to zero. But we see quite a dramatic decline of GDP, and that's mostly driven by decrease in consumption, and it is also related to how the other countries in the world respond, that I will show in the other slide. And the last option, which seems the most optimistic result, is the result when this green investment increase would be funded from abroad, so the EU would attract more money from the global bank. And there we do see quite a big impact of technology learning. So you see that the green curve is quite diverging. And this small table here shows that this is a percentage difference in 2040 between these two scenarios. So we see that green sector's production, it's a production volume. Green sectors really grow a lot, but there are positive spillovers to other sectors as well. For example, agri-food, industry, and services, all sectors benefit from improved or from increased green investments and from the technology learning. I also mentioned in the previous slide that there are some important effects on the rest of the world, and this slide demonstrates this. It actually shows that EU is not the isolated player, but there is an open economy, global economy. So the first scenario that only looks at domestic impacts where there is a domestic crowd out does not have much effect on the world. But the second scenario, where EU would increase savings rate to finance its green growth, shows that the result is actually the contrary than expected. So EU's GDP declines, but the GDP of other countries go up. How can we explain this? Well, we have to realize that the investments are collected by global banks. So the EU, although it saves more, it also, the global bank collects this and redistributes it. So there is a leakage, and at the end, EU does not gain, the other countries gain. So we see this scenario is probably not very desirable. But this last scenario...
Sorry, okay. 2 minutes.
Yes, maybe I will continue with the other slide. The emissions change, so that's of course the environmental aspect what we are looking for, and what we see here that the impact of all scenarios independently of the financing brings the desired or the expected decline of emissions, and we observe GDP-driven effects. So these scenarios, obviously, where GDP declines also then hand in hand will lead to the decrease of emissions. But even in scenarios where GDP would be increasing for EU largely, we see also emissions decline. And that's the effect of the greening, so increasing share of green sectors and the technology learning. I think I will show the last slide, and that is a bit more zoom into the sectoral effects. Here we see green sectors, how they are supported by the green investment policy that and the technology learning that brings an additional boost in production. Well, there are some other sectors that benefit from it. For example, primary agriculture, especially when we assume technology learning, well, because agriculture provides primary resources for bioenergy. So there we see also positive effect. And let's go to the conclusion. So we have investigated the impact of green investments, where we incorporated various methodological improvements into the magnet model. And what we see from our first results is that we see quite an important effect of the financing that leads us to a further investigation. So I will get to the next step. So in general, the impacts are positive if we allow for external financing. And we also see quite some important linkages with the rest of the world. So the EU green investment policy can also impact the emissions of the third country. So that's something to have also in mind. And next steps is because we saw the importance of financing to introduce cumulative savings to model debt and long-run closure to improve model solutions in multi-annual steps. So that's I did not have time to introduce here, but so to incorporate modeling of debt and cumulative savings, and of course integrated with other magnet instruments that are already there for climate change mitigation, like the CO2 taxes, MAC curves, and natural resource supply module, and still look more on the work on R&D investments. So I think I hope I'm on time, but that was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for this interesting presentation. I see from the chat that Dominique has a question.
Thanks, Susanna. Really nice work. Yeah, I had a question on the directed investment. I mean, I think it's a policy issue. I mean, whether it's done by Brussels or whether it's done in the individual capitals. But I was wondering if you thought about, like spillover effects. Let's say, France or Germany has comparative advantage in the research area, so all the money would then just go into one of these leading countries, and then the other countries would just, benefit from spillover effects from that. And then the comment has to do with, I'd be a little bit cautious about saying GDP rises with an increase in foreign savings, because in principle, those have to be paid out at some point. So there are dynamics involved there as well. So just a word of caution on that.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much, Dominique. It's the notion about spillover effects is definitely interesting to investigate. We have now done a scenario that we looked at a proportional increase of investments in each of the EU country, because we don't also have yet any concrete plans for the EU member states how they want to distribute the money, but I think indeed what we have seen that there is a lot of these spillover effects, and that could be an interesting scenario to see, consider that the major investors are the two biggest countries, and what does it do for the others? We do have individual member states in our model, so we can possibly also investigate it. And about the GDP effects, okay, this is a good thing to take into account. Important to realize that these effects are maybe just temporal, and later on, indeed, they need to be paid.
Wolfgang, can you ask your question? You are still muted.
Susanna, thanks. Quite interesting. So could you explain how to read this learning rates for R&D? What does this mean basically for factor productivity or something else?
Yes. I would like to. One moment. I will maybe share once again. I have actually a slide on the learning rates. So I will try to quickly show this. If it's have it. Do you see it now?
Yes, we see it.
Yes. Okay, so we have this learning rates we took out from literature, and learning by doing and learning by research are basically implemented similarly. So they are introduced as a parameter that increases productivity. Maybe I had one more slide that explained exactly, but I don't want to. Yes, so not enough time. So basically, we take the productivity coefficient that there is in magnet AOL, and we link it with learning by doing and learning by research rates. Where learning by doing we multiply with growth of the capital stock because it represents the installations, and learning by research we multiply with growth of knowledge stocks, and knowledge stocks we accumulate. Based on some literature evidence.
Okay.
That satisfies your answer.
Yeah, I mean, but I was wondering, I mean, I presume you have the same mechanisms in then for all the sectors when you run your baseline?
We implement these learning effects only for green sectors. And we have it for baseline and for the scenarios, the same, yes.
But then by design, I mean, by redirecting basically this to the green sectors, you get a boost, right? Which you don't get if you put it into something else. I mean, this sounds curious. So why don't you have learning if you put it in the automotive or in the chemical industry? Yeah.
Yes, it's still work in progress, and we wanted to focus on bioenergy sector. So at this moment, it's also from the literature we have. We most often come across with learning rates for the solar and for the wind, etc. But true, there can be also learning effect for fossil fuel. Yes, so that can also be introduced.
I see that Maxime also has a question.
Yep. Thank you, Susanna, for the nice presentation. Very interesting work. So one result I was wondering about, and it's a bit unexpected, you touched based on this. So when you increase the savings rates, the GDP drops quite significantly in the EU. So we did some single country modeling work and for Eastern European countries, and what the results that we were observing there, we were linking a TG model with energy system model, that the increase in savings rate boosts GDP and welfare quite significantly, but again, in a single country framework. And that's simply because, well, in the macro framework, savings rates increases, so in the long term, you just get more investments, you get higher production, and that boosts the economy. So, I mean, the explanation seems to be kind of straightforward. But in your case, what is observed, so the savings rate increases, and the investments are redirected to like green sectors, which have like a higher, well, they have this feature of learning by doing so. In principle, they should contribute to like a higher productivity, like contribute to growth. But what is actually observed is like a complete different picture. So I was wondering, you mentioned that you have this global bank and that it redistributes investments. So I'm wondering, is it the specifics of implementation? So what if you would leave investments within each country, yeah, or would redistribute it in a specific way between EU countries? Can you comment on this a little bit? Because it's somewhat unexpected to see this. Thanks.
Yes, we also were surprised, but how we explain it is that here I show a table with net saving positions, and our scenario it's actually a massive change in the DP save parameter to accommodate it. And so we explain this, that these savings rate increase, but these investments don't stay in EU. They are used abroad. So other countries benefit from it because of the global bank. And indeed, there could have been a different way how we implemented that. We force that that these investments don't leave the EU. So that's why I think there is this really negative effect. So there is a savings rate increases GDP, but in the world, but not in the EU. So that's a little bit surprising, and probably it has to do with the way how the scenario is designed, that it does not control for the fact where the increased savings go. So there's the global bank that collects them and redistributes them back. And for example, this is net savings for rest of the world. We have 941 billion and 254 after. So we see that clearly savings minus investment decreases. So there is more investment going to abroad, which it's maybe indeed because you work with a single country model that didn't have that kind of feedback effect or the connected financial market.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the explanation. Yeah. But yeah, maybe you can try also other setting, as you mentioned, where investment would. Okay. Thanks.
Oh.
I see that Wolfgang made another comment in the chat.
Yeah, but I mean, you addressed this yourself. I guess that's what Dominic said. Huh? The problem is that, I mean, if you increase the saving rates, you are driving up basically the outflow of financial flows to other countries. But even in your recursive dynamic model, I mean, this has no future consequences. So normally, if you finance something abroad, you have a return flow in form of income in the periods which follow, but that's currently not the case in the model. Yeah. So so the global banks assume that you basically look at the expected returns, but these expected returns come never true in the current model. Yeah. But you said, I mean, the moments you build in debt accumulation, you have naturally also then something which reshuffles the interest rates back to the original investors. I think once you have this in, you will see another effect from increasing the saving rates.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks all for this interesting discussion, and Susanna for her presentation. And then we can move on to the next presentation, which is a presentation by Xiong-Si Kai. I hope I pronounced it vaguely correctly. And this will be a presentation about the roles of technical change and climate policy for greenhouse gas emissions from US transportation and electricity generation. Xiong-Si, the floor is yours.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Okay, you can see my slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You're not seeing the first thing, right?
We're not seeing the presentation at the moment, but I think your site with the notes.
Sorry, I'm still trying to work out how to move that too.
Yeah, maybe you can try sharing your screen again, and then instead of going to presentation mode, just go to full screen mode, so that. Oh, yeah, I think now it's fine.
Now?
Yeah, now it's good.
Okay. Okay, my name is Yongxia Cai, a research economist at RTI International. The work is joined with Robert Beach and Jared Woodard-Cart. I hope to discuss the advanced technology in transportation and electricity and how their role in the climate greenhouse gas emission reduction. So in the Environmental Protection Agency's 2019 inventory report, it find out the total GHG emission is around 6,558 millimetric tons of CO2 in 2019. That's similar as the level in 2005. The transportation and the electricity production account for 29% and 25% of total US GHG emission, respectively. And the transportation alone, the 96% of US transportation is powered by the oil. And also transportation itself accounts for 71% of total oil consumption. In the recent years, the coal-fired generation have declined significantly, but in 2020, 57% of generation continue to come from coal and natural gas. Also, it's already down from 63% in 2018. In April 2021, the Biden administration released the new national climate commitment. So US pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030. This commitment is significantly higher than previous pledge, which cut emission by 26 to 28% by 2025. In addition, United States set a goal to reach 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035 and net zero emission for the entire economy wide by 2050. This is really an ambiguous goal that put all the pressures on the entire economy, especially in the transportation and the electricity, which are the biggest emitter. On the other side, the alternative fuel vehicles, that use biofuel, natural gas, hydrogen, or battery electricity generally have higher fuel economy than the conventional fossil fuel vehicles. So they are suggested as low carbon alternative to reduce the dependence of fossil fuel and to reduce GHG emissions.
technological improvement has been significantly reduced the cost of renewable electricity generation, especially in solar and wind, make them competitive with the conventional natural gas generation. So in this study, we use adage, a computer general equilibrium model to assess the market potential of this AFVs and wind and solar, and see how they contribute to the net zero emissions. So adage is a recursive dynamic multi-region, multi-sector model. It has 8 regions where US, China, and Brazil are standalone countries, while the rest are grouped into 5 other regions. It has more than 60 sectors with great details in the energy, transportation, electricity, agriculture, and advanced technologies. It solved the model in 2010 to 2050 in 5-year time step. So it also incorporated all the dynamic characteristics like the labor productivity, energy efficiency, then capital accumulation and depreciation. The transportation in adage is separated into 8 modes. Then we also introduce 4 alternative fuel technology: natural gas, battery, hybrid, and fuel cell 2, 3 on-road technology. This technology has similar CES production function, but for the backstop technology, we have one more less for fixed factor that enters the top nest of function. The biofuel is allowed to use for all on-road transportation to replace refined oil. However, it's not available for other transportation like air, water, or other. These 3 figures shows the fuel economy trend for 3 on-road technology. Basically, battery has the highest fuel economy, followed by the fuel cell, then hybrid. Conventional and natural gas vehicle has the lowest fuel economy. The production cost in terms of dollar per passenger or ton mile traveled is shown in this for this 3 on-road technology. We can see that the battery is already cost competitive in 2020 for the light duty, but it has lower cost in freight and passenger bus after 2030. The electricity in adage has 3 conventional, 3 backstop, and 6 renewable. For the carbon capture storage, we assume 90% of carbon is captured. All of this technology can compete with each other for electricity generation. They also, each technology also has similar structure with other, except the backstop and the renewable has a fixed factor on the top nest. The production cost of electricity generation is shown in this figure. The data is from the NREL 2020 annual technology baseline. All the technology has downward trend, and the solar shown in the blue, and the combined cycle natural gas have the lowest cost after 2030, then followed by the wind and combined cycle natural gas with carbon capture and storage. We introduce 4 scenarios. The reference assume that there's no carbon emission reduction target. The net zero by 50 is the policy that US pledged to cut the emission by 21% by 2030, then reach net zero emission by 2050. We also have introduced 2 more scenarios that reach the net zero emission by 2060 or 2080. The emission trend is converted to 2010's value because the model doesn't have 2005 and also doesn't project 2050 beyond. So it has linear reduction between 2020 and 2050. So all the emission reduction target is applied to all greenhouse gas emission sources, but we exclude land emission, and also the emission is applied to all regions. So this is to avoid the leakage in some extent. We hope to understand to what extent can transportation and the electricity sector contribute to the net zero emission target, and if there other low carbon energy sources could help reach the target. The challenge in energy is that although it has advanced technology and abatement option for greenhouse gas, but it lacks advanced electrification technologies for other type of transportation and household and other industry sectors. So we find that the model has difficulty to meet the net zero by 50 in 2050 scenario. So we relaxed the last year's constraint to 2% instead of 0%. This figure shows the transportation service production by technology. So the blue, purple, and red are light duty truck and bus with different technology. We can see that as the reference case, that each production rise. So the total service production rise over time, and for the on-road transportation, the hybrid vehicle act as transition technology between conventional and the battery vehicle. However, even for the light duty part, even though the battery vehicle cost is already lower than the conventional, we still see the penetration is small and gradually expand. So this is because the durability of light duty, people tend to keep the vehicle for 15 years if that works. However, in the climate policy, the total transportation service production is affected slightly by stringent policy. The battery vehicle expand faster to replace the conventional counterpart technology. In the net zero by 50 case, during 2045 and 2050, it not only replace the conventional counterpart, but also replace other transportation mode. For example, battery replace the airline transportation. So in order to meet the stringent target. This shows the electricity generation by technology. Again, in the reference case, the total electricity generation rise, but we see the coal-fired power plants continue to decline over time, then replaced by the combined cycle natural gas, and the wind and the solar rise substantially. Under the climate policy, the coal combined cycle natural gas will decline, but on the other hand, the renewable like wind and the solar and also carbon capture and storage increase, but their rate is slightly lower than the reduction of fossil fuel. In the most stringent case, net zero by 50, we see there's reduction for the renewable and also reduction on the carbon capture storage. This is the policy is very stringent. It puts pressure on all the electricity demand sectors. We put the emission in transportation and we put the comparison of the emission transportation and the total emission target side by side. So the right side is the target, left side is the emission in transportation. We see that without any policy, just technological advancement could reduce the emission by 34% by 2050. So this is from 2010's level. Under the climate policy, during 2020 and 2040, the emission actually dropped slowly than the economy-wide policy. But after 2040, the emission dropped faster than the economy-wide target. So after 2040, it can reduce the burden of other sectors. But before that, it actually needs help from other sectors. We also compared the greenhouse gas emission in electricity side by side. Again, on the reference case, the technological advancement can reduce emission by 53% by 2050. But in the climate policy, the emission actually drop faster than the economy-wide target during the entire horizon. However, in the net zero by 50 case, by 2035, there's still around 10% emission. So this would not reach zero carbon emission goal that's set by the Biden administration. So I hope to conclude that the results are very preliminary, as the introduction of other mitigation technologies for industry and household are very critical to meet the zero emission target, but they are not available in the model yet. So we plan to add them in the next few months. And with the continued advancement in FWs and electricity generation technology, the carbon neutrality by 2060 or 2080 is more achievable, as it can expand to battery vehicle and solar wind generation, and it also puts less pressure on other sectors. To achieve zero carbon emission goal by 2050, the United States has to promote or invest more on the electrification, especially in industrial and household energy efficiency program for use of cleaner, renewable energy sources. Without large technology improvement, achieving zero emission by 2050 in the United States and for electricity sector by 2035 is really an ambitious goal. Another conclusion is that renewables such as wind and solar and mitigation technologies like CCS play an important role in mitigation CO2 emission, but we also need to develop other like negative emission technologies. So this is not only for the model itself, but also for the United States in the real world. My slide is over. Any questions?
Thank you, Shangshai, for this interesting presentation. I see some questions in the chat. First one from Wolfgang.
I hope that is an easy one because you have shown on your first slide basically miles per gallon for electric cars. I mean, that sounds curious because they don't use any gasoline.
Yeah, electric car only we separate the technology into 4 types. One is hybrid, one is electric car. So electric car only use electricity. Hybrid is using electricity and fuel, so that's mixed. So they can change the mile per gallon.
And then I see that Dominique has a question. You are still muted, Dominique.
Sorry about that. So we do similar types of things, particularly in electricity. We haven't done too much yet on transport. We do a little bit, but what we struggle with is kind of non-price changes and preferences. So I'm not quite sure how your electricity markets work. In our case, we have these different generating technologies. They produce electricity, which we treat as a non-homogeneous good. So we have a CES aggregation function, and and we do have pretty big changes in relative prices. But even with that, we only have slow penetration of solar and wind and potentially other technologies like CCS. So we have these we slide, if you want, the share parameters of the CES function to have non-price changes and preferences for these technologies. So I was wondering if you do something similar, and I think it's linked to my actual question, which is, you really hammer electricity in that net 2050 scenario, yet you have presumably pretty huge increase in the demand for electricity coming from the transport sector. So you're really starving, presumably, kind of the conventional users of electricity, because you got that huge shift in demand downwards, but a huge increase from the transport sector. So I'm wondering what that does to your economy.
Yeah, can you see the slides? We put the elasticity between technologies. So the substitution is 0.3 to combine. Yeah. So they are not homogeneous goods, but for the consumer, they do treat the electricity as homogeneous goods.
So are you changing those share parameters at all, or you have to invent them for technologies that are not yet in use? For example, CCS, yeah. So you got it, because they're all zero right now. So you have to introduce.
Yeah, that's a very small number at the beginning, but then in the future, they were like a CCS in natural gas. They have bigger substitution between conventional combined cycle. So the substitution is 5 in this block.
By the way, we're using, our top level is 3, so it's 10 times yours. And that gives us, MAC curves that seem pretty reasonable. It'd be interesting to see your MAC curves with such a low level of substitution across these different technologies. Have you, or is this econometrically estimated, or have you tried to back validate it to some extent?
We try to calibrate that to the AO projection in the reference case. Also, we have the fixed factor. So the fixed factor is assumed to grow at the previous level. So that's used to capture the dynamic part.
All right, I'll stop there.
Okay. Hopefully answer your question.
I see that Maxime also had a question. 2 questions even.
Yeah, so thanks for presentation. My first question is, did you deal with the agricultural sector, with emissions in the agriculture? And if so, how do you decarbonize, so let's say, livestock? Do you have like a huge net sink from land use? Or?
Yeah, we have agriculture, but it's for the land. Right now, we do also have the emission from land use change, but for this rounds, I didn't incorporate the emission target because the whole scenario round is actually based on the EMF 37 that we joined recently. But in the EMF 37 scenario 30, the emission target is also 50%, 60%, 80%. Reach zero emission by 2050 or 2060, 2080. But their emission is only applied to the CO2 emission. That includes land use change. Here, I purposely exclude the emission from land use change. We have for the CO2 emission, if they use fossil fuel, then that's the mitigation is just on the CO2, but we have abatement on the non-CO2 emission. But we don't purposely to see how the contribution of mitigation on the agriculture side. So right now we focus more on the transportation and the electricity sectors.
Okay, so is it net zero total GHG or not? I maybe to rephrase this.
Say again.
Is this scenario net zero total GHG emissions or net zero CO2 emissions?
Oh, here is net zero for all GHG emissions, including CO2.
Okay, but you just did not report what's going on with agriculture. I mean, it's third of all GHG emissions. You can't abate more than 15% there. So apparently we have to do something with the rest 85%. But this is something you would explore. Okay, I got it.
Yeah. Yes. We need to explore like all sectors, how their roles to contribute to the zero emission. This is really ambitious. So
okay,
if they couldn't, if they couldn't meet the target, they probably just reduce the output of the production. But that's not realistic.
Okay, yeah. Food production probably wouldn't reduce. Well, yeah. And my second question is on the data side. I was wondering, where did you source your cost structures for different transportation technologies?
The basic cost data is from GTAP. So we aggregated them to the 8 sectors in energy, because GTAP has very detailed transportation sectors. They have class size, mode. However, because this project is supported by EPA, so it's further modified by experts in the EPA. And the data is not publicly available right now.
Okay, so the cost structures are publicly available from GCAM, yeah?
Oh, you mean cost structure?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, the cost structure is from ourselves. Just the production cost is from EPA, then based on the GCAM data.
Okay, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Okay.
Susanna, you had a question.
Yes, I just wanted to double check, how do you achieve that important or significant growth in the renewables like solar and wind? So you have some exogenous productivity increase, or do you also have some technology learning curves in the model that stimulates the increase of the renewables?
If you see this figure it has downward trend. So that means it does not have only energy efficiency improvement, but also has like a capital reduction. So that would mean it's like the learning by doing is already incorporated into the cost structure. So we don't explicitly say how the learning doing contribute to the cost reduction.
But so these costs are exogenous then, or?
Yes, this is exogenous part. We include them, then we use this structure to see how each technology competes with each other.
Okay.
The key factor is also Dominic. I actually tried to run sensitivity analysis on the top level substitution and the fixed factor substitution part. And also the endowment of fixed factor, they really play a big role. How big the renewable or CCS would produce.
Well, thank you for the lively discussion. We have run out of time, so we have to go on to the fourth presentation. And the fourth presentation is by Gabriele Standardi, and he will present something about assessing macroeconomic effects of climate impacts on energy demand in the EU subnational regions. Gabriele, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the nice presentation. And so let me say, first of all, that this is a joint work with colleagues Shoro Dasgupta, Ramiro Parrado, Enrica De Chan, and Francesco Bosello. So basically, we try to assess the macroeconomic effects of climate impacts on energy demand in the European subnational regions. So, okay, let me sketch very briefly the outline of the presentation. First of all, the motivations and objectives, then the methodology, where I will describe the data sources and the model, the experiment design, where I will present the baselines and the impact modeling and results, and finally conclusions and further research. So for motivations, In the literature, we can find a lot of papers which study the effects of climatic stressors on energy demand. However, this macroeconomic assessment of these impacts on energy demand following climate change are missing at the European subnational level. And the European policymakers, by the way, are increasingly interested in having a more detailed representation of these macroeconomic effects. So the aim of this work is exactly to meet these policy needs and to fill this research gap. And for this reason, we use a computable general equilibrium model, ICES model, which was regional coverage has been extended to the subnational detail for the European countries, as we will see later. Then, of course, for the sources, for the data sources, we start from the Global Trade Analysis Project database, version 8.1. And then of course, to regionalize the social accounting matrices, we integrate this information with data coming from Eurostat. And then another important source of information for us is the World Electric Power Plants database, which is a georeferenced database for the basically power generation plants. And using this information, we are able to split the electricity sector into different power generation technologies at the subnational level for the European countries. So for the methodology, of course, we have to basically from these data sources to get these subnational social accounting matrices and to make the regional sums mutually consistent through the flows of imports and exports. So we basically refer to the methodology in Bosello and Standardi, which takes place in 3 steps. So we first split the value added in GTAP using the Eurostat information at the subnational level, and then we rely on the subnational location quotients to obtain the subnational domestic demand and aggregated imports. And then, of course, we apply a simple gravitational approach based on the kilometric road distance between the capital cities of each couple of regions within the country to get the bilateral trade flows within the country. At the end of this process, basically we get this database with 138 NUTS regions for Europe, subnational regions. Of course, for big countries like France and Germany, we have either a NUTS 1 or NUTS 2 level, but for small European countries, we keep the national level, so the NUTS 0 level. But at the end, we have 138 regions. And then, of course, we take advantage of the global nature of the GTAP database. We have also 18 macro regions with the main global actors, so USA, China, India, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, this is important also because the impacts on energy demand we have, these impacts are also from the rest of the world because we are conducting anyway a global analysis. For the basically for the sectors, we have 24 sectors. You can see here. So from vegetable and fruits to public services, and then, as explained, we put special attention on the electricity sector because we take advantage of the information from the World Electric Power Plants database, and so we have these 6 different technologies: nuclear, fossil power, wind, hydropower, solar, and other renewables. Then the structure of the ICES model is very similar to that one of GTAP e-model. So you can see that the nests are quite the same, and also the parameterization is very similar. Then, of course, we model additional bundles for the electricity sector with respect to GTAP, because we have basically a Leontief between the electricity bundle and the transmission distribution, and other lower bundle, for example, between intermittencies and non-intermittencies. Here, the parameterization is based on the paper by Beckman, Herzl, and Theiner in 2011. And then, of course, another important point is the structure for trade. We keep the double nest, the double level of GTAP. So we have the upper level, which links domestic demand and the aggregate imports. And for this, we use a CS function. But then for the lower level, which breaks the aggregate imports according to the country origin of the product, we implement a crash function which allows to have more flexibility in the choice of the bilateral trade substitution between products. And here the assumption we made is that we keep the same parameterization of GTAP for countries or for the regions in the rest of the world. But then, of course, for regions within the country, we assume that this elasticity of substitution is 1.5 higher than the elasticity of substitution of GTAP. Now, these are the baseline scenario we consider in our experiment. So we have 9 SSP-RCP combinations. So we consider a wide spectrum of socioeconomic and climatic characteristics. We have 4 SSP, 1, 2, 3, and 5, and 4 RCPs, so 2.6, 4.5, 6.0, and 8.5. And the impact assessment is run from 2015 to 2070. Then, of course, as you can imagine, the calibration of these baseline scenarios has not been an easy task because of the size of the model. So to make a long story short, what we do is to, first of all, replicate the GDP and population targets from the SSP's database, assuming that the subnational regions follow the projections of their respective countries. But then, of course, we further characterize the SSP-RCP combination using a number of variables you can see here. So, for example, the fossil fuel prices, for example, the efficiency in clean energy production, the substitutability between electric and non-electric, and also trade openness, which turns to be a very important assumption, as we will see. Especially here, we assume that in SSP3 there is a limited trade openness. And then, of course, in some combinations, for example, those with RCP 2.6, we implement some simple climate policy in the form of a uniform global carbon tax. Now, how the models have been introduced and how the energy inputs have been calculated and introduced in the CG model. So basically, we start from the paper of Dechan and Siu Wing. Here, the authors estimate basically the elasticity of energy demand with respect to temperature for 3 energy carriers, electricity, petroleum products, and natural gas, and 4 sectors, agriculture, industry, services, and residential. Then these elasticities are combined with the high resolution ensemble mean temperature projections coming from these 4 regional climate models. And this has been done for every RCPs, so for 4 RCPs. So basically, at the end, we are able to reconstruct the percent change of energy demand in a given sector for a given energy input up to 2070, which is the final end of our assessment. Then, of course, to implement these changes in the model, we do this assumption. We basically assume that if, for example, because of temperature increase, the energy for cooling is going to increase in Europe, basically this means that the representative firm will need more inputs to satisfy that level of energy requirements in terms of cooling. And in our opinion, this can be interpreted like an efficiency loss. If, on the other hand, for example, because of temperature changes, the demand for heating is going to decrease in a given region, this means that the representative firm, to satisfy that level of energy requirements in terms of heating, will need less inputs. And this can be interpreted like an efficiency gain. So this is really the key assumption for our outcomes also. And then, of course, this is true for the 3 sectors, agriculture, industry, and services. But for residential sector, as this is not a productive sector in the CG model. Basically, we assume we implement exogenously these shocks, imposing these shifts on the energy expenditure for the representative household, and then basically we let the model adjust endogenously to calculate the remaining expenditure in the other sectors of the economy, keeping fixed the household budget constraints. But this has not a direct effect on efficiency, like the shocks I was mentioning before. It's a more redistributive effect, which doesn't capture the winner-losing dynamics between regions. Then, this just to give you an idea about the main trends here we have implemented in the CG model. So this is because I have 12 different impacts for RCPs. So here I just report the main trends and the main RCPs, which are the extreme RCPs 2.6 and 8.5, because in RCP 4.5 and 6.0 basically they are somewhat in between these two extremes. And then you can see that, for example, the gas demand from industrial sector is expected to increase in Europe, and these increases are more pronounced in RCP 8.5 and in the Southern Europe. The same is true for example, the electricity demand from the service sector. Here, the increases are more pronounced in RCP 8.5 and especially in Southern Europe. And keep in mind that electricity demand is a good indicator of the cooling needs in a given region. And so this, given what I have said before, this must be interpreted like an efficiency loss. On the other hand, for example, if we look at the oil demand for the service from the service sector, we can see here that this demand is expected to decrease, especially in RCP 8.5, even here in the Southern Europe, but also in some regions in UK, Ireland, and France. Of course, this the oil demand is a good indicator, for example, for the heating needs. So this must be interpreted like an efficiency gain, on the other hand. So if we look at the results, these are the GDP percent change, the aggregate results for the European Union plus United Kingdom in 2050 and 2070. So in general, we can see that the results are always negative, still moderate. Anyway, for example, in two combinations, SSP5 RCP 8.5 and SSP3 RCP 4.5, the losses are bigger than 0.4%. And another interesting result is in all the combination except these two I was mentioning, and also SSP2 RCP 6.0, there is a declining pattern of the negative macroeconomic effects moving from 2050 to 2070. So this means that mitigation policy actually can help to mitigate the negative macroeconomic effects. And these macroeconomic effects can be important also in the RCPs, in the higher RCPs, like the 6.0 and the 8.5, where the emissions are higher, but also in the SSP3, and this means that also the socioeconomic characteristics of the scenarios are important, because if you remember, in SSP3 we made the assumption of a limited trade openness, and this is important because, for example, firms cannot substitute the energy inputs because the markets are not very well integrated. So this slides is just to give you an idea about the distributions of the macroeconomic effects moving from 2030 to 2070. So you can see that over the years, this distribution gets more and more spread, and especially in 2070, SSP5, RCP 8.5, there are gains, but there are also substantial losses up to 7% and more than 7%. This is Cyprus, as you will see later. But in general, in 2030, results are negligible. The effects are negligible, apart except these two small islands, Malta and Cyprus, where given the energy inputs we have not negligible negative effects already in 2030. Then to have a further geographical characterization of these macroeconomic effects, maybe we can look at these maps at the evolution of the results moving from SSP1 RCP 2.6, which is the cleanest scenario, to the SSP5 RCP 8.5, which is the scenario with the highest level of emissions. And we can see that as we move from the cleanest to the, let's say, most polluting scenario, the colors get more and more reds and orange. And the negative effects are localized, especially in southern Europe. You can see, for example, here that in SSP3 RCP 4.5 we have all orange and red colors, and this means that we have negative macroeconomic effects everywhere. While in the other combinations, for example, especially in RCP 2.6 and SSP2, we have blue colors. So positive effects, gains, which are localized in the northern part of Europe. So to understand better this the winner-loser dynamics, the geographical winner-loser dynamics, we can see at the top bottom 100 results. So all the scenarios considered. And this basically gives us an indication about the loser regions in 2070. We can see that all these regions are in the southern Europe, and there is a Cyprus and Malta, and then other regions in Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Greece. And there are losses greater than, bigger than 1%. And there is especially Cyprus in SSP5 RCP 8.5, which can lose up to 7.5% around this value. And the opposite happens for the winner regions. So in this case, these are the top 100 results, so the best results in terms of GDP percent changes, all scenarios considered. And we can see that, the GDP gains here are a slider, but there are some regions located in the north part of Europe which can gain something, especially in SSP2 RCP 2.6.
2 minutes, Gabriele.
Okay, thank you. And I have almost finished. So to conclude, we can say that the negative macroeconomic effects can be substantial. Negative macroeconomic effects of climate impacts on energy demand, especially in regions located in southern Europe and in SSP5 RCP 8.5 and SSP3 RCP 4.5. And then there is especially in Cyprus, and also Malta and other regions in Portugal, Spain, Greece, and Italy. Then, of course, also the socio-economic characteristics is important, as we have seen in SSP3, RCP 4.5. And of course, as a policy implication, it is important that Southern European countries immediately start to invest in more efficient cooling technologies. Because the main driver here is that the increased cooling demand from these southern European countries. And this is I think one of the main drivers of these macroeconomic outcomes. And then as a further research, it would be nice to improve maybe the shock on the residential sector, because so far this shock has mainly a redistributive effect and doesn't capture really the winner-loser dynamics, because it has no direct effect on the efficiency. And also, of course, but this is true for all kind of impacts, climate impacts and in general impacts, to further refine the baseline, especially in terms of convergence of GDP per capita within countries, and also to assume different degrees of labor mobility within EU. And of course, perform many checks on consumption, shares, and prices. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Are there any questions?
Hélène, perhaps I could. Gabriele, I'm really impressed with this work, and at the center, we're thinking more and more about introducing a version of GTAP that has built-in sub-regional modeling. So we were thinking about Europe, of course, because there is quite a bit of data there. There's also a new database for the United States. I've said this in other presentations. I'm not sure why you're not using a more recent version of GTAP. Is it because of the European data is aged, or version 10 would seem to be better suited for the work you're doing, particularly the power version of the database, which has, 11 generating technologies. So you wouldn't have to do all that work on splitting out the electricity sector. At least we would have done part of it for you.
No, yes, thank you. No, actually, it's a very practical reason, because the result of this, of this work is part of the COACH project, is an Horizon 2020 project, which started like 3 years ago. And so at the time, I used the GTAP 8 database because I had already started with the regionalization even 1 year before, because it takes time to collect all the data at the subnational level, to split all the sectors, and of course to balance the social accounting methods. So for this reason, for consistency, for reasons of consistencies, I kept using the GTAP 8 database even in the following steps of the project. But of course, I agree with you that the GTAP 10 model can be much better, and also can facilitate my work. So it's just a practical reason linked to the project.
The other question I had is, so you have a SAM for each one of the subregions? It's a full SAM, so production side, demand side, and fully bilateral trade. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct, but maybe as I had this presentation in Warsaw 2 years ago, where basically I want to stress the fact that this method I used can be a reasonable method if you look at the overall trade relationships between the countries, between the subnational regions, of course, because it can give you a reasonable idea about the importance of the trade flows, etc. But if you keep one single region, not two regions or subnational regions, maybe this is not the best method to use, because if you want to focus on one single region, this is it's just is basically downscaling a global database at the end of the day. So you do a lot of simplifying assumption. But yes, I have a full-fledged CG model where basically the regions, the subnational regions, are exactly like the country in GTAP from the theoretical point of view.
Okay. No, we were thinking of maybe a hybrid approach where we don't model bilateral trade within the regions, only across nations, and then just have a national market for domestic goods. But yeah, very good. Thanks.
Here we have bilateral trade flows, but of course across the subnational regions. But still, if you want to have the general national representation, it can be reasonable. But if you focus on that one single trade flows for that for that single regions or a couple of regions, I don't know. But still, here we are interested in having the overall macroeconomic effects and to see the winner and loser regions. So in this sense, I think that it can be okay, the model. And then of course the other value added is the inputs we have, which are really from the colleagues Shoro, Dasgupta, who has estimated this using regional climate models for high resolution in regional climate models. So we really have these energy inputs at the subnational level. and also for the rest of the countries in the rest of the world.
I see that Wolfgang also has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriele. Quite interesting. I mean, I have this kind of hybrid approach which Dominique was talking about, where I mean, I have the production side split up two regions, but not the demand side and certainly not trade. And in that context, I wonder a little bit. You said you put 50% on the GTAP arming elasticities. And then you're focusing on energy. So I'm not sure, for example, for electricity, what to do with this arming elasticities in the GTAP database. I guess there's not much electricity traded across borders. Yeah. And if you want to change there, you need to change the grid. And I mean, at least if I follow the social discussions, it seems to be quite hard basically to build to expand the power grids such that you can easily transport more electricity from A to B. Yeah. So have you challenged, so to say, the model in that respect, if this exchanges of especially of electricity in your shocks make sense?
Of course, it's true that, for example, within the country, the electricity is not treated like an homogeneous good, because there are Armington elasticities also within, I mean, from the regions, for example, within a country in Europe. So in this sense, I mean, if your point is this, yes,
yeah,
for this. No, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, the point is a little bit probably for the given grid. Yeah, the basically this arming elasticity is close to infinite, right? So
Yeah.
if you have, as long basically as the grid allows you to transport the electricity, it works fine.
Okay.
But this is normally not something basically where you have this nice response curve. Yeah. So the moment basically you exceed a certain transport capacity, you are done. Yeah. And there is no price response on this any longer. Yeah. Either you have the capacity to transport or not. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, okay. First of all, the electricity. I mean, good is a bundle from is a bundle between the electricity bundle, let's say, and the transmission and distribution. So in this sense, and I mean, I try to capture to some extent some limitations in the transport and transmission of electricity between regions of the same countries. Between regions, I mean, this limitation on the electricity production within countries. But of course, yes, this is one of the limitations of the model, because this is an economic model, and there is already the difficulty to, I mean, to have this full-fledged subnational CG model. But then, of course, we should work more on the modeling of the electricity sector and to better specify it maybe within the country. But for now, I mean, this is mainly an impact assessment. So let's for now we have done this, but of course we keep improving the modeling, and we will try. We are open to suggestions and to, I mean, to further development. I don't know if I have answered your question.
Fine. I mean, it's more an understanding and also what you're planning to do, because I have a colleague who works on something quite similar for Germany, so I guess he would be interested to learn what you're doing here.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I think we're exactly on time to wrap up. So Yes, I would like to thank this is dan our final presentation and discussion, and I would like to thank all the presenters for their very interesting presentations and papers that they wrote, and I hope you all help me in thanking our presenters.
Thank you.